Welcome, good evening. Welcome to the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University for this discussion on the US election and the world. My name is Andrew Preston. I'm professor of American history here at Cambridge, and one of my specialties is diplomatic history. So I'm really excited for tonight's webinar. This webinar will look at how foreign policy and national security issues will affect the presidential election in November, but also how the election might shape US domestic politics and foreign policy. And not only that, not only what goes on in the United States, but also how American domestic politics interacts with world affairs and how each influences the other. One of the most exciting subfields in my own field of American diplomatic history is the politics of national security. For a long time, we thought that policymakers just responded to external threats and opportunities, but we now realize that they themselves are intensely political actors, even if they're not legislators or have or sit in elected office. So how will domestic events shape foreign policy in 2020 and vice versa? We have an extremely fast-changing world scene. If we'd held this webinar 4 months ago, we'd be talking almost exclusively about China, maybe a bit about Russia. If we'd held this webinar 2 months ago, we'd be talking about nothing but COVID and the economic fallout from COVID and international blame games and so forth. And I'm sure we're going to talk about both of those things as well. Today, of course, Black Lives Matter and race relations in the United States is the issue in American politics, but also in foreign policy. And as we've seen here in the United Kingdom, it's a major issue in British domestic politics as well, in addition to relations with the United States. 2020 surely has more surprises to come. This has been an extraordinary year in so many ways, but maybe we're also in, I hope not, but maybe we're also in for some more major systemic shocks. With me to sort through everything is a distinguished panel, and I'm really excited to be talking with them this evening. All are now working on international issues in the private sector, and all have distinguished government experience before in the US and the UK. I'll introduce them and then get us started with some questions. After that, we'll turn to the audience for your questions. Please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom or top of your screen, bottom or top, depending if you're on a desktop, an iPad, a laptop, or whatever you're using. But use the Q&A button to submit your question and type it up. When you do type up your question and send it to us, please include your name, your institutional affiliation, or where you're from if you don't want to reveal or mention your institutional affiliation, and who your question is for if it's not for the entire panel. Well, with us tonight are Amy Pope, who is a partner at Schillings in London. Before that, Amy was Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, and she also worked in the Department of Justice. Next is Stephen Schrage, who is with Delphi Strategy International, a strategic advisory firm. He is a former senior State Department and White House official and foreign policy director and staff member for major US presidential campaigns. And we're also joined by Tina Fordham, who is partner and head of global political strategy at Avonhurst, where she advises institutional investors, corporate boards, and international organizations about global political development. I'm sure development is also one of her areas of expertise, but she advises on global political developments. I wanted to get us started with a general question for all of the panelists. Amy, maybe we could begin with you. And I just wanted to ask, what's at stake in this election? What's at stake for the United States? What's at stake for the world? And how are Americans thinking about, if they're thinking at all, about foreign issues when they're going to cast their vote in November?
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Center for Geopolitics for having this very important discussion and bringing this group together. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you virtually this evening. So what's at stake? I mean, I don't think that it would be overstating it to say that the institutions that were created post-World War II are effectively at stake. The traditions of cooperation, of the alliances across Western Europe in particular and other democracies, I believe that's at stake. And and sort of a traditional role of the United States as a leader in responding to a host of critical issues, including things like the coronavirus, is at stake. I mean, it's this president is not necessarily partisan. He is not acting the way that we would imagine a Republican president enacting a Republican leadership principles to behave. Certainly not acting the way you'd expect a Democratic president to behave. And I think it's fair to say he's not acting the way an American president would behave. At every turn, we've seen him exchange, working with our allies for doing what is most politically expedient for him. He, particularly on the foreign policy stage, every action that he's taken is effectively to be viewed through a lens that is domestic rather than what is the impact on the world as a whole. And I think when we look at what's happening with COVID, that's probably the most very near-term specific example. We've not seen any leadership from the United States in terms of marshaling a response. We've not seen leadership from the United States when it comes to preparing for a vaccine. We've not seen leadership when it comes to engaging with other countries that may have less or fewer resources, or even building the kind of response we would expect at the multinational level, just given the fact that the virus can spread so easily across borders. So, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I will turn it over to our other panelists just to start the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for getting us started. Stephen, for you, what's at stake?
I think when you look at the campaign as it's unfolding, there's really three big things to think about. The first is these campaigns really operate on two levels. There's kind of the surface level, the public level. There's really kind of a subterranean level, which they really don't expose to the public. For example, you might see a campaign will have thousands, hundreds or thousands of public advisors, but there's usually a group of 5 to 10 that are really influential in terms of what happens with the candidate, especially on issues like foreign policy that aren't at the front of domestic policy agendas. The second is, and I think as Professor Preston noted, this has been kind of something that's been debated in academics, but who sits in the Oval Office matters incredibly. Scholars like Robert Jervis used to say that leaders don't matter, but even they've admitted that it was the fact that Bush was in the White House, not Al Gore, that led to the Iraq War. Obama with the Iran nuclear deal, or with things like opening up to Cuba, which Trump quickly reversed. Who is there makes a huge difference. And then finally, when you look at the two individuals and the choice we're going to have, there are two big divergent paths for foreign policy and where we could go. With Trump, traditionally, if you don't like what Trump's done or you love what Trump's done, he's really going to be unleashed if he gets a second term, particularly in terms of foreign policy. A lot of times presidents try to make their legacies in foreign policy in their second term because they're far less constricted than they are in domestic policy, especially if the House remains Democratic. On Biden, we've got, even though he seems like the traditional candidate, ironically, he's quite rare. Since the end of the Cold War, you're going back 30 years to when the Soviet Union still existed, we haven't had a new president who's come into office with extensive foreign policy experience. They've all been virtual neophytes or blank slates. And the fact that Joe Biden is an old foreign policy hand has both positives and negatives. And one of the things that you can't escape both with Trump, but particularly with Biden, is they are old foreign policy hands. People debated that Reagan was too old to be president when he left office. Biden will be older than that when he enters office. Trump is also going to be one of the oldest presidents. So that really puts a lot of burden on his advisors, who's shaping the policies over time, particularly. And it's hard to ignore also where we're in the middle of a pandemic that has targeted men of this particular age. Who is the vice president? How prepared they are to lead is something I think that you have to take seriously as well.
Yeah. Before I turn it over to Tina, can I just ask a quick follow-up, Stephen?
Sure.
You said that, in a second term, Trump could be unleashed.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm struggling to think of how different he would be if he was, I already thought he was off the leash. So
well, even
what does Trump unleashed look like?
If you look, well, that's what's going to be, the $1 billion, $1 trillion question. But you look at it and you read the reports of what's happened internally. He used to have people like Mattis and others kind of checking him. He did that largely because if you read it, he's been very focused on reelection. after election and kind of the post-Cold War, post-9/11 powers of the presidency, doing things that used to be considered acts of war, whether it's through drones or intelligence surveillance or special operations, he's going to have a lot more leeway and a lot more concerned about what his legacy is than appeasing Congress or worrying about another election.
Gosh.
So, again, that he's going to have a lot more range to act.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Tina, for you, what's at stake this year? You're muted. I think your mic is muted. Hello?
Okay, well, anyway, so it's always tough going after two very eloquent people who have spoken before you, because I get caught up in the interesting things that they're saying.
I think we've lost Tina for a second. We can come back to her in 1 second when she comes back on, when she's unfrozen. Let me turn to a few more specific things that Stephen and Amy have been talking about, and talk about that, and then we'll bring Tina back in when her reception is kicked back in.
Sorry.
Oh, hi, Tina.
Okay, there we are.
We lost you right at the start. So if you could tell us again, if you could tell us what's at stake.
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
I was marveling at the previous panelist remarks, which I thought gave us a lot to think about. So I'm trying to think about how, through my lens as a political scientist advising investors and business leaders, who normally non-US, I should add, the question that I get asked most often from them in thinking about the future occupant of the White House, is pretty universal, and it is, will the United States ever be a normal country again? And this is regardless of the political orientation of the questioner, right? Plenty of people on the political right in Europe have been, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, etc., have been uncomfortable with this presidency and the kind of perceived erratic nature, as well as the implementation of rule of law, global trade, and some of the other things that we've hinted at. So, I suppose my answer to the question would be, if we have 8 years of President Trump in the White House, then Trumpism, to a certain extent, becomes the new American normal, even beyond his term in office. Meaning that 8 years of influencing the global environment, whether foreign policy, trade, security, etc., is going to be much altered by President Trump being in office for that long. The purpose of our discussion today is very much to focus on the international implications, but what I keep thinking about is perhaps picking up on what Amy said about the Bretton Woods institution, the Washington Consensus, the whole post-war order, is the extent to which both the coronavirus and the racial injustice protests have kind of suddenly catapulted us into the 21st century officially. And, on the point of the two elderly gentlemen who we have as candidates, are either of them really up to the task of taking the country to, through these unprecedented crises? I mean, Joe Biden's promise was really to take things backward to the Obama age, and Obama himself was no great foreign policy president.
I'm sure that'll prompt some questions as well. That was a fantastic way for our three panelists to get us kicked off. What Tina just said about how she's getting asked by people, when will the United States be a normal country again? I think that's how you phrased it, or if it will return to normalcy if Trump isn't reelected. It raises the question of American exceptionalism, which perhaps some of our audience might want to ask about. I jotted down in my notes as you were speaking, Tina, has the United States ever been a normal country, either for better or for worse? And if it isn't, or if it is, either way, is Trump doing something completely unprecedented, which is something we could think about as well. I did a Center for Geopolitics event 4 years ago in 2016 in the Nightmare Scenarios series that the Center for Geopolitics runs. And it's a possible scenario that might happen that would be a nightmare. And the nightmare scenario in 2016 was, what if Donald Trump is elected president? And of course, we've seen the effects. Again, you could, whether you love him or loathe him, I don't think anyone would argue that he hasn't been different and he hasn't broken the mold. So with that, to get us kicked off, I'd like to turn to some more specific questions for our panelists. Stephen, I'd like to begin with you. You've worked on campaigns. You've been sort of, in the trenches, advising on foreign policy issues. What do you see that's different this time around, if anything is different, when you look back at your, through the lens of your own experience working on campaigns, or if you look back at history, what's 2020 look like to you in terms of the politics of national security?
Well, I think it's very interesting. And I wanted just to, if I could, just jump back to one thing you just said a second ago.
Of course.
One thing that has been interesting is how much people, particularly the Washington kind of insiders, the traditional Republicans and Democrats, have said, Trump has disrupted the world order and upset things. I think you can make a strong argument up until potentially the coronavirus response that Bush disrupted the world order far more than Trump did. When you look at things like the Iraq War, what he did on preemptive war, what he did on surveillance, the torture questions, and the global financial crisis. I mean, Trump has, if anything, been resistant about exerting U.S. power in some ways than the others have. So so it's an interesting argument. He's upset the D.C. kind of establishment norms, the traditional thing, but on a global scale, he hasn't pulled out of the WTO. It's been kind of more stasis with a few real specific exceptions. In terms of the difference in this campaign, one of the things that's really interesting is I noted over the last 30 years, we haven't had kind of a foreign policy experienced president come into office. It's always been the rebel or the choice that's on the outside, whether it was Clinton against H.W. Bush, whether it was W. Bush versus Gore, whether it was Obama versus all the people he was supposed to, and Trump really disrupted that apple cart. And you've seen that in the Tea Party and everything else. Americans have been rebelling against Washington and kind of this establishment for 30 years, given the choices. So it's going to be very interesting that now you've had probably the most extreme candidate, Trump, elected, who's very unpopular. And then you've picked someone who you couldn't have more of a bastion of the establishment, for all of his years in Washington. So it's going to be a very fascinating dynamic to see how that plays out over time.
Absolutely. We have a populist president, really, for the first time in maybe since Andrew Jackson, maybe ever. And he's a disruptor in so many ways. And that, to me, is the real difference with Donald Trump. He's a George Wallace or a Pat Buchanan or William Jennings Bryan, somebody like that, but he actually won the way. He actually took power. And now we're seeing how that works at the highest levels. And by the way, the panelists, if you want to respond, as Stephen just did, to anything anyone says, of course, go ahead. You can ignore my question as well. Amy, let me turn to you and ask you, based on your experience in the Democratic Party and the people you know and the issues you know, to you, what might a Biden presidency look like when it comes to foreign policy?
The interesting thing here is that Biden does have a long history in foreign policy. Of course, he served as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee within the Senate, and he engaged quite actively on a number of foreign policy issues while he served as vice president. I mean, in some ways, he was a non-traditional vice president. He had very meaty foreign policy areas of engagement. I personally worked with him, for example, on a Central American strategy where he made several trips to meet with the presidents of the Northern Triangle in Central America, where he met with the leadership of Mexico, and he was very, very actively engaged. And I think that was one of the reasons why President Obama chose him, because President Obama recognized that his own foreign policy credentials were relatively weak. And so that gave Biden the opportunity to step in. But I think the bottom line is the American public doesn't care that much about foreign policy. I mean, they worry when things go very wrong, but as an election issue, this is not going to be at the forefront of their minds. In some ways, President Trump has been very effective in turning China, for example, into what's effectively a domestic issue. But most Americans are just not devoting the headspace to thinking through what are the implications of our relationships with our partners in NATO or with the United Kingdom or North Korea, with South Korea, for example, vis-a-vis North Korea. So, it's not to say that President Biden will be sort of recapping of President Obama. I think his far deeper experience, he has his own points of view, but it will be much more traditional. We'll be much more relying on our relationships, relying on existing treaties, relying on multilateral institutions to engage, looking to provide global leadership, looking to set the example when it comes to various whatever's happening in the world, and that is more like a President Obama presidency.
It's so interesting, and if anything, we've seen Trump on China sort of bring the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party is sort of moving in all sorts of directions, and that's not necessarily a criticism. A lot is going on, but Biden's stance on China has noticeably hardened in the last 3 or 4 months, and so we see that effect too.
It's interesting. Just one thing on that is that I do think on China there's been a lot of there are more similarities on the China policy than people would assume. The difference is the way in which the engagement is happening. President Trump has been very, very bellicose, as everybody knows, and I don't know that any president has ever tweeted about China, but the concerns about some of the unfair trade practices, concerns about security and technology, those existed before President Trump came to the scene.
And so do you think on issues like that, a lot of the concern about China in the United States that does resonate with voters is of an economic nature? It's about jobs, it's about maybe internal security. Is that when, because you said this really interesting comment that I'd like our other panelists to think about as we proceed through our discussion this evening, that the US public doesn't really worry much about foreign policy issues. The implication being that voters don't go and cast their ballot based on the particulars of a foreign policy issue. And I guess the question then would be, unless perhaps it has a domestic or economic ramification, or maybe because it has a kind of, it's a signal as to whether somebody is competent, incompetent, or strong or weak. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you think about the Vietnam War, the American public was concerned about the U.S. intervention there, but it was more because of the impact on domestic policies, politics, lives, et cetera. It wasn't really about what is the balance of power in Asia and how will our involvement impact that. And I think the same is true of China. I mean, the difference here is also framing of the solutions. I mean, President Trump is going after China in very aggressive ways, but he's not really providing an alternative. So there are countries around the world that are really torn about whether they are to engage with China, not to engage with China. And in some ways, the fact that China continues to step up, for example, again, with Corona, to provide assistance to countries that need it, when the US is really drawing inward, is making it more difficult.
Yeah, and do you think that Trump's stance on China is being driven by domestic politics?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, that might be a good place for me to pick up, because if we're going to talk about how foreign policy might change or not change, depending on whether Trump or Biden are in the White House, I think it's important for international observers to remember that although polarization between parties in the United States, only continues to intensify, there are a few reliably bipartisan areas of agreement, and they happen to be China bashing and being tough on Russia and Iran. And so for many multinational corporations and others doing business who will be watching this election, they'll be looking to see whether we'll continue to see the use of sanctions, perhaps a rising economic nationalism, as you often see in the aftermath of economic downturns like we're going through now. And I think that those will be trends to look at carefully. And we should bear in mind that it's historically been Democrats who've been the toughest on free trade agreements and, for example, labor protections and things like this. So we shouldn't necessarily look for more lenience on that front, although I think Amy's right that a more traditional role for the U.S. in participating in international organizations would be something you'd see return to in a Biden presidency. There is a kind of a fantasy amongst the Washington think tanks in particular about this sort of return to a mythical, golden age of U.S. leadership, and that will be the answer to everything. But, again, here, I think we've got to remember that although these global institutions are the only things we have, whether it's the United Nations or the G7 or others, they've been regarded as deeply flawed for a long time and in need of modernization. We've just never been able to do that successfully.
Yeah. And yes, Stephen, go for it.
And I think too, you raise an excellent point, and I may have to take somewhat of a different perspective than Amy, particularly on the China question. But I remember even dating back to the 2008 campaign, to Tina's point, I think there was a broad agreement by both parties that this structure built in the 1940s, imagine trying to use like a computer operating system from the 1940s, was vastly outdated in a world where technology, information is traveling around the world. And it never really got updated during the Obama administration. And I think China is a huge, huge problem that's going to come up for Biden in this, and where there are extremely significant differences. I think some of that is the legacy of him being part of the Washington consensus for decades, where people are saying perhaps the biggest strategic mistake was to let China into the WTO without any kind of real human rights standards, labor standards, environmental standards, to what was basically an authoritarian government. And he was kind of operating on the old mindset of the Washington establishment for most of his career. Now I think that has been revealed both in terms of the economic policy, in terms of disease consolidation of authority, where people like Bush were saying openness would lead to democracy. It's been 100% wrong.
That's right, but the 21st century challenges, neither of these leaders are prepared for.
Can I
perfect example.
Go ahead. And then we also want to hear back from Amy too, because she's on. Yeah.
Gotcha. Let me just wrap up real quickly. So and then when you look at what the coronavirus situation, where you have to wonder why was Beijing travel banned from Wuhan, and it didn't spread around China, but it was allowed to spread around the world. I think there are huge issues there with security that killed more Americans than just about any war in recent history. These are huge questions where Trump called for a travel ban and took action that Biden opposed. I think this is going to be a big issue. And the question for Biden is, can he get out of that mindset and look to the future?
Okay, Amy.
There's so much there. Where do I start? One, it's wrong to say that Trump pushed for a travel ban that Biden opposed. I mean, look, what Trump really should have done was to look at Europe, right? If you look at all the cases that were coming to the United States, it was actually Europe that was the key issue. But bigger than that, I mean, frankly, was that there was just a reluctance within the US government to take action at an early point in time. And that is the most troubling. Having lived through managing a response to Ebola and Zika, I can tell you we left in place a comprehensive approach to responding to epidemics, none of which was operationalized in this presidency. So, I mean, I just kind of can't let that go. But on the bigger issue of Iran and Russia, I actually think that there are pretty significant differences between the way Trump has responded versus the way a President Biden would respond. First of all, on Russia, I mean, you'll never see a President Biden being besties with Putin. I mean, that's just absolutely incomprehensible that any American president has behaved the way that President Trump has behaved. And yes, we can point to the fact that there have been sanctions against Russia, but the fact is that when you have someone at the top who's consistently undermining that message, I think it really changes the way in which the United States is engaging around the world and the way our partners see it. Likewise, with Iran, I mean, the fact that this president undermined immediately the JCPOA and then ultimately dismantled it, that was a way forward on Iran that had really been built with a coalition of partners. And so I don't think it's fair to say that they had the same policies. I do think, Tina, you made a great point, which is that these institutions were not operating effectively. And the best thing that a President Biden could do is to take the opportunity of the disruption brought about by President Trump and use it as a way to reform the institutions so that they are, in fact, fit for purpose. But I don't think the answer is for the United States to withdraw, especially and things like funding for the World Health Organization. It really ultimately not only decreases US influence to these in these important institutions, but ultimately globally.
On that note, can I come back to Tina and ask you on sort of the note of Trump and disruptions and a lot of anger that he was speaking to in the United States to international organizations and multilateral treaties and so on and so forth, especially about the economy. One of your specialties is Vox Populi risk, is assessing Vox Populi risk. And I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit what that means and what it means today when populist movements in the United States, but also around the world, are having such huge political importance, whether it be Make America Great Again and Trumpism or Black Lives Matter or any other kind of social protest movement. Tell us a bit about Vox Populi risk and what it means for American politics and the world today.
Thank you. So the idea of Vox Populi risk, which I first conceptualized in the aftermath of the Arab Spring protests in the beginning of, especially in Europe, non-mainstream political parties rising, was the idea that more volatile and more quickly mobilized public opinion would be a disruptive force in the business and investment environment in a way that wasn't necessarily true in the past. And certainly with Arab Spring and the other big EM protests in 2013, 2014, this was the case. In 2016, of course, we had the election of two, you could say populist presidents, well, President Trump and then the UK referendum on the European Union, regarded as a populist agenda put forward by UKIP originally, that moved to the mainstream. And whether we're in we're in the midst of another surge in populist sentiment. So far, we've seen the racial injustice protests and in some cases riots we're still in very early days. But what's important about them from the perspective of looking at the anatomy of protests is the extent to which they have a varied constituency, right? Multiracial, big cities, small cities, every state in the union. That's important. So the movement itself has legs. I think part of what is also usually a good indicator for the strength of a movement to coalesce and eventually translate into policy demands is the simplicity of a message. Occupy Wall Street, for example, did not have a clear message. What does it mean to occupy Wall Street? But what Occupy Wall Street did have was this notion, we are the 99%. That ended up being a very powerful slogan, but one that a lot of people gravitated toward and was used again in many settings. Now, will the Black Lives Matter protest translate into a clearer policy agenda? I think that's possible too, because focusing on police reform is something that is driving this wider participation in the protests. Plus, we had a completely unambiguous moment with the recording of this man's murder at the hands of police that has really focused attention. The fact that the moment of these protests also happens in the midst of this unprecedented lockdown is probably also important. Now, it's not moving markets, but I do think that there is a potential for it to impact the policy agenda. It also doesn't play to President Trump's strengths. Most investors and business people believe that Americans vote, almost totally on the basis of their own pocketbook, right? The economic performance of the country. At the moment, if you look at the top issues for Americans in this election, the economy and unemployment are actually a little bit lower down the list than you would expect at a time when unemployment has skyrocketed and we're entering a recession. In fact, racial injustice and of course the coronavirus response are closer to the top. So these are big tests for the president. He's not doing well at them.
A question for all of you, and then I'll turn to audience questions. And I'd just like to remind the audience, if you do have a question, please type it up, send them in. We're getting some questions in, and I'll turn to those in a minute. But on the question of Black Lives Matter, it's so pressing, for not just for Tina, but for the whole panel. What does Black Lives Matter do for American legitimacy worldwide? What does it do for America's relations with its allies, with its rivals? What does it mean going forward, not just for American society and police reform and what it means for domestic politics, but what does it mean for foreign policy? The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s had a profound impact on American domestic politics, but also on foreign policy. And I'm wondering if we're at a similar type of inflection point, and if the U.S. reputation is suffering abroad, or if it is, as Senator Murphy argued in Foreign Affairs recently, whether this is actually doing the U.S. a service in terms of its reputation by showing democracy in action. Amy, what's your assessment?
Look, I find it difficult to say that it's doing the U.S. a service. It is certainly bringing to the surface issues that have been a significant problem in U.S. society for a long time. What I found really interesting, though, is that it has galvanized a response globally, and that has shocked me, frankly. Sitting here in London and watching protests take place in Hyde Park or other places across Europe, that's significant. And there's something really valuable about the fact that that conversation is no longer just about what's happening in the United States. More problematically, though, frankly, has been the president's response, particularly some of the very, very well publicized attacks on protesters who were not violent, the clearing of Lafayette Park before the president spoke at the church. Things like that, I believe, are very undermining to the American image abroad, and particularly this image that we've tried to project really in defense of democratic values. So there's this tension here where the president is behaving in ways that we would normally condemn if it were any other leader,
Right.
the US government observing it.
Right, there's this tension between what's going on, say, in Hong Kong and then what's going on in the US and how leaders are acting to it. And people have noted that, of course, this cognitive dissonance or even hypocrisy. Stephen, what's your take on these issues?
I mean, I think this is an incredibly important issue. And I think, as Amy mentioned, the thing that's been most surprising to me is how it has spread globally almost instantaneously. You're seeing the marches in Paris, you're seeing them around the world. It has really hit a nerve across the world at this time, and even given everything that's going on with coronavirus. I think in terms of how it will be used, as you just mentioned, you look at things like Hong Kong, you look at other situations. I think the authoritarian governments traditionally have used these type of events in America to undermine our credibility. And especially as we're now engaged in kind of a global, competition. I don't know how you want to phrase the exact word, but rivalry with China, especially in many emerging nations, how this is pitched and sold is going to be very important. And then just in closing, one thing I want to jump back to, one other thing, I think it is, as Amy talked about, the responses to Europe and pandemics domestically, but I do think there's a very clear distinction in terms of how Biden and Trump both dealt with China in terms of the coronavirus and the travel ban, that I think is something that's going to get played up quite a bit in the campaign.
Great. Thanks, Tina. Do you have any more thoughts on Black Lives Matter before we turn it over to questions from the audience?
Well, I have a lot more thoughts about it, I suppose.
Just about legitimacy and America's reputation and that sort of thing.
Well, you can see in recent survey data that's boosted U.S. reputation. But if there is anything that completely confounds international observers about the United States, it is our unparalleled tolerance for violence compared to our OECD peers. And so, with that in mind, an event like Sandy Hook, right? The mass murder of tiny school children horrified the nation genuinely, but failed to move the needle on gun regulation, better gun regulation in the end. So I'm kind of holding back on suggesting that Black Lives Matter will transpire into large scale reform. But the militarization of the police actually goes back to the 1967-68 civil rights anti-war protests, and accelerated in particular under President Clinton. And that could be reversed. I think it will take more than protests, even sustained protests. It'll take leadership to address the inequalities built into the US system. But we really do shock the world in how much we tolerate these levels of violence and inequality. And we've lost the trade-off that might have justified this, which is the social mobility. The argument that, our country is flawed, but we have unmatched social mobility. We don't anymore.
Right. And just the firepower that is in private hands in the United States right now is exceptional, not just private personal hands, but also in the hands of the police. Just to get a shameless plug in here that I wasn't planning on, but I wrote about this in a Toronto newspaper this past weekend, the Globe and Mail, about the militarization of the police forces since the 1960s and 1970s. Let's turn to some audience questions. A lot are coming in. I'll begin with one from Edward Abu Jaoud, who asks, just for the panel in general, not for anyone in particular, what is the effect of the election this year on the peace process in the Middle East? Who wants to take a stab at that? Amy, can I call on you?
You can. I mean, I think that this is one of the important distinctions between what President Trump has done and where President Biden would be. I mean, if President Biden would very clearly be in favor of a two-state solution, he said so explicitly. The relationship that we have seen between over the last 3 years with President Trump really effectively erasing that as a solution here, as an outcome here, and really pandering to Israel in particular, the government in particular, without trying to figure out a solution, without putting serious people in charge in terms of deciding a solution. I mean, I just think that you'd see a very significant difference. They're both going to Israel. There's no question there. But in terms of trying to figure out something that will work here, I just think it's quite significant.
Okay, Stephen, Tina, do either of you want to add to that?
I can. I think very sadly that resolving Israel-Palestine has dropped right down the list of U.S. presidential priorities for quite some time. There isn't really much left for a two-state solution, even if a President Biden were in favor of it. The facts on the ground have really changed. And a few other important pieces in the Middle East landscape have changed as well. One is the intensification of the Saudi-Iran rivalry, and many had predicted that the shift to U.S. energy independence would lead to a weaker relationship with the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf state energy producers. That hasn't happened. And also the back channel diplomacy that has opened up, well, it's not even really back channel anymore, between Israel and Saudi, for example, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I'm not optimistic about renewed vigor on Israeli-Palestinian peace process discussions. And what's more, we've also seen that even US presidents who are deeply committed to it, personally and in terms of putting senior advisors there, didn't resolve it. I'm afraid that it doesn't have the rank that it once did on foreign policy priorities, and the change in energy dynamics means that where I once would have been on a conference call to investors when there was firing between Hezbollah and Israel, that's now not the case. It doesn't cause a spike in oil prices, that instability, which means it commands less attention.
Stephen. Yeah.
I think this is going to be a very big issue, and it's something that I was very surprised at the end of the Obama administration, and Israel plays an outside role in domestic U.S. politics, because it's something both for evangelicals and for a huge group of Americans is a very passionate issue. In addition to all the Jewish contributions that have been made to America over the years. And at the end of the Obama administration, there was probably more strain in the U.S.-Israeli relationship than I've ever seen during my time in government. You had President Netanyahu getting invited by the Congress without the approval of the president to go give an address opposing the Iran deal, and really raw emotions and tensions that I'd never witnessed. When President Trump came in, he tried to recalibrate and actually said that he was going to make this a priority going in, but very much aligned more closely with the Israeli side and with potential allies he thought in the region like Saudi Arabia. It hasn't really yielded a lot so far, and I think it's increased tensions. But I think this could be one of the foreign policy issues, specifically for certain segments of the U.S. voters, that could make a difference as we look towards 2020.
Especially, yeah, for domestic politics. That brings us back to one of our themes. Let me turn to the next question. This is a really, really important question. It's also very loaded. I know it's something that the panelists wanted to discuss. It comes from Marie Langrish, and I hope I got that right. How confident can we be that this election will be perceived to be free and fair with respect to voting rights, absentee ballots, and so on and so forth? And what are the consequences if the election isn't perceived to be free and fair? And it's extraordinary that I'm asking this about an American election in the year 2020.
Yes, maybe Moscow will send observers to monitor our elections. That would exactly be what Putin would like to do.
Those offers have been made before from a variety of countries.
Yes.
Tina, what do you think? What are the consequences? I mean, what are the prospects of it being free and fair? What are the prospects of it not being free and fair? And if it isn't, if there's any question, what are the ramifications?
I actually think that the answer to this question is perhaps as important as who wins the election, right? The actual process and machinery of democracy in the United States, and there's really one determining factor to whether a country is a democracy, and that is the loser accepting the result. And we have a scenario now where there's genuine concern that might not be the case. And President Trump, I think, gave an interview recently where he said he would leave office if he were defeated. But I think more than a few of us are concerned about, some scorched earth tactics in the run-up if it looks close. There's also the purely functional aspect, which is the United States has antiquated voting machinery and equipment. Who among us remembers the hanging chads and the state of Florida outcome, which got referred to the Supreme Court and held up official result for a couple of weeks. That was obviously Bush Gore. I think a replay of that kind of scenario, which was purely functional, would be more disruptive and cause more volatility. The fact that we're having a conversation about whether there are going to be enough mail-in ballots, the scenes in Georgia and other US states recently of very long queues to vote, the fact that investing in better voting technology, and I don't mean electronic, which I don't see happening in the US, but just better run, better equipped, and that's even separate from what is another very real risk to this process, and that's voter suppression, which takes many forms in many states and is a legacy of the Jim Crow laws in the southern states in the US.
And is becoming as important an issue for Black Lives Matter as police reform.
That's right. Well, because for Democrats, if Democrats voted, they'd win every election. They're greater in number. They tend to also not be disciplined enough to turn up at the polls for various reasons. But there isn't enough time to improve access to voting. And meanwhile, laws have been passed in some U.S. states where, for example, it's no longer allowed for a church to send minivans to round up elderly people and take them to the polls.
Okay, let's bring in Steve. I know Stephen has something to say, and Amy, I'm sure you do as well. And then we'll move to a couple more questions from the audience. They've started to come in thick and fast, and we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'll try and get to as many of these as possible.
I was just going to add really quickly. I was down counting chads in Florida in 2000 during that whole debacle, and it is a national embarrassment that we don't have, 30 years later. This is governed at a state level, but really kind of secure voting systems that are working and verifiable going forward. And this is something that the international audience may not understand. It's like you can pretty much throw out a lot of the national polls. Elections are decided by a small handful of states, and voting is governed by those states and how that plays out. So that's where the real action is. If you should be looking at a handful of state polls, almost throw out the national polls if you're looking at the horse race question. Finally, I would say I think the notion of Trump staying in is kind of way overblown. But there is, I think, a serious issue about administrations and transition of power. And I think you even see this in the whole Russiagate, Spygate, Obamagate investigation. You had investigations that crippled, the Trump administration for years based on evidence that now has been shown to be purely false. And I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole on this, but I don't think anyone thinks
that's not a thing. That's not a thing. I mean, I can.
It's okay. I was personally there. I know it's a thing. We could. I don't think we should divert this to another.
Yeah, that's not real. So, but I think, look, what is real is that there is this president has not taken seriously what is a pretty significant concern, which is foreign interference in our elections. And that's really puzzling because we would expect that any president would very highly value that and put it at the top of his agenda. I think what he's really doing is trying to seed in the American public the doubts about the election. He's creating room for a narrative that he lost the election through unfair means. And that's also very true because it does seem like he's setting the stage to call into question if the election itself, if he does lose.
Okay, I've got, we can come back to those if you'd like, but we are running out of time, and I do want to get some questions here from the audience. I have two questions here on US-UK relations, which is not surprising, given where we are and given the issues we're discussing. One comes from a very learned question from Tony Bryan, and another comes from Sean Klein, and they're both asking about US-UK relations, about what's going to happen to US-UK relations after the 2020 election and how it's going to change depending on how it's going to be affected depending on who wins, and also what this means for Brexit, what a Biden presidency or what a Trump presidency after November 2020 will mean for people, for those of us here living in this country. And that's for all the panelists.
I can start. I think that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made a US-UK trade deal really his biggest hope, his biggest policy hope between now and the end of the year when the UK is due to leave the European Union. If President Trump is not the winner of this election, that'll put a serious blow to Prime Minister Johnson's hopes for that trade deal. He has really put his eggs in the Trump basket. I'm not sure that a President Biden would necessarily penalize the UK, but the kind of alliance between those two leaders has been pretty robust and clear.
Stephen, Amy, your thoughts on US-UK relations?
Look, I think the US and the UK, the notion of the special relationship is a real thing. And I know that any president is going to value the relationship. I do worry a bit about it, though, because one of the key roles that the UK played for the United States, at least in the national security world, was basically acting as a conduit or an ally with regards to the EU, because the US and the UK tend to be so well aligned. And there is a concern about whether the fact that the UK is now outside of the European Union, whether the United States, and particularly under President Biden, will develop closer relationships with the German government, for example, or other governments that it thinks may be able to better influence what's happening within the European Union.
Stephen?
I would say a lot of people have looked at Biden gave a speech at Chatham House in 2018 in October, where he had kind of talked about more aligning with, people have read it as his more aligning with Europe than the UK. I think it's a little bit premature to read that out of that speech because I think this relationship is so strong and you've seen things develop where, like, for example, between Clinton and Bush, Tony Blair, built that relationship over time. So a lot of it's going to depend on the personal connection going forward. I think the US-UK free trade agreement is a challenge for a number of different reasons, but you've seen coronavirus and everything dominate what's going on. In another situation, had all these controversies and problems not occurred, they might have locked that on track before Trump left office. Now it's going to be up in the air. And if you look at the materials on Biden's website and what he said about trade, he says, we're not going to stop free trade agreements altogether, but he wants to do things domestically before engaging in new ones, which might kick it down the road quite a bit.
Right, smart trade deals instead of free trade deals, which is what people want to strike now. It's interesting that I'm hearing from the panel that there is still a specialness to the special relationship.
I'm less of a buyer of the specialness. I think that it has eroded, and I further think that.
Do you think it's gone? Do you think it's totally gone now?
I think it's an idea that is much more meaningful and well formed in the minds of people in the UK than on the US side. Remember the huge perceived slights when President Obama and Michelle Obama gave the box sets of the videos. Was seen as very insulting. But let's also bear in mind, when we think about the future of the US-UK relationship, that not only is Brexit happening, which will diminish the UK's weight in the global order, but the European Union has managed to take advantage of this crisis to push through reforms which are actually going to strengthen the EU, I think, in ways that have surprised both the US and the UK.
Yeah, I've always been a skeptic, a little bit of maybe a cynic, maybe a skeptic about whether the relationship is truly special. And then it's come in waves since Churchill first coined the term in 1946. And then every time I think it's done and dusted and buried and we're not going to talk about it again, it's revived, and there's another sort of special relationship that emerges.
It's the cultural heritage that I think we should be, that will persist. I mean, Tina is right. The view of the relationship to the United States is significantly diminished if there's no UK in Europe. And I think there's no question about that. But there is this sort of, in the American ethos, there's this cultural attachment, and the legal system and everything else that I think will persist.
That Americans value it too. Here's a question from Thomas Maguire at King's College London, and it's about the process, the policymaking process of foreign policy. And he asks, how might the process and execution of US foreign policymaking change or not change, depending on who wins in November? And whether that's in terms of the size of the State Department, the role of the military, how the NSC functions, the relations between the White House and the intelligence community. What does the election mean for the policymaking process?
Everything.
I know all three of you have experience in this.
Yeah, everything. I mean, look, there is no process right now, which is the most alarming thing. Whether you agree with the outcome or not, the National Security Council process has been completely eroded. So where you have a process of bringing out an idea, fleshing out the pros and cons, having the deputies meet and the principals meet and then the president weigh in, that is completely gone. And instead, you don't even have confirmed actors in many of the policy-making spots across the federal government. And that's significant because that is the way in which the process is developed and the solutions are arrived at in most administrations. So I think it's fair to say that you would see under Biden, we'd revert back to some kind of process because right now it just doesn't exist.
Well, but Amy, do you think he would put resources back into the State Department, which has been hollowed out? I mean,
absolutely. I think the State Department, the Justice Department, the EPA, I mean, across the board, the civil service has been decimated, in addition to the political leadership being decimated, in addition to the budgets being cut. And I mean, it's just over and over again on every single level. And I think
for that to happen, you'd need Democrats to have both chambers, it seems to me.
I don't think so. I think actually my sense, and Stephen will jump in here, is that my sense is that actually most members of Congress value that process. They feed into it. They have accountability and oversight. in a way that's not really happening now. So if you have a Senate confirmed head of something, the Senate can actually bring that person in and hold them accountable, and the senators love that. Right now, it's not really clear that anybody's accountable.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting time. There's been more turnover in the Trump administration than I think in any administration history. I think it's been documented, particularly in senior levels like the NSC, national security positions. And I think that has resulted in a lot of this turmoil. And I think the process would be extremely different under President Biden. And I do think there's a kind of an institutional desire on parts of the Hill to kind of rebuild some of these institutions over time. Now, I think the downside of that is I think Trump, for better or worse, has challenged some of the common wisdom or common knowledge or intransigency of some of the bureaucracies that I believe Biden would probably go more with the flow of where they've gone in the past.
Okay. We are just slightly over time, but we did begin a few minutes late. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to combine a couple of questions from the audience, and then I have a final closing question for the three of you. One question comes to us from Casey Lynn, who's based here in Cambridge. In fact, he's well known to the people in the Center for Geopolitics. And he asks, he's essentially asking whether Trump is going to put on his Kissinger hat and play Russia off China in order to isolate China. So a reverse of what Nixon and Kissinger did. So how likely is it that he is going to, once he's unleashed, as Stephen put it, is he going to reach out to Putin to disrupt the Sino-Russian partnership in the Arctic, in the Middle East, in Africa, and on technology, and so on and so forth?
Well, I've met and spoken with Kissinger a couple of times, and I don't think that President Trump has either the will or the capacity to undertake that level of realpolitik strategy. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. The president is not a chess player, right? I mean, at the most, he might be a tactician. But no, I don't see that moment emerging.
Yeah, love them or loathe them, Nixon and Kissinger were brilliant, brilliant men who certainly knew what they were doing.
Kissinger reminded me that before he went to China and the détente emerged, that he had visited dozens of times and invested in developing those relationships.
Stephen.
I actually worked with Kissinger quite a bit on several campaigns at CSIS, where I was a chair, and he's actually said quite complimentary things about Trump over the time, especially early on. Whether you can debate his capacity to carry this out, I think it's something that he has made clear early on, even from his first campaign, that what is his desire to kind of leverage Russia against others. Has it worked? I mean, obviously, Putin has not been the compliant partner he wanted, or maybe what he envisioned him to be. I don't think you can say it has worked, but I think that was obviously what he clearly telegraphed an intent of his early foreign policy positions.
What do you think?
I'm going to vote with Tina here. Look, this president has shown no ability to engage strategically. I don't think he's really governed by any certain foreign policy outcome or strategy. I think he's governed by what's in his best interest at that particular moment in time. So if he sort of accidentally happens into some solution where he plays one country off the other because it happens to suit his particular agenda at that moment in time, maybe he'll claim credit for it, but I don't think it's even credible to claim that he would intend to do so.
Okay. Stephen, did you want to respond to that before we
no, I didn't mention, the point was not about his capacity, which you can, but the point is intent. I think that's pretty clear, and there's quite a bit of evidence of that. And I think that's pretty indisputable. Whether you think he has the capacity to do it is another question.
It's another question indeed. We have to bring things to a close, unfortunately. This has been really stimulating. We are slightly over time, and I apologize to all of those, to those of you who sent in questions and we just weren't able to get to them. But we will probably discuss them, and all of us will be discussing these issues as we go forward between now and November. And that's really my final question for the panelists. What should all of us, in your opinion, what should all of us be looking for between now and November? What should we be watching out for and paying attention to?
Who do you want to go first?
You, Tina.
Okay. Well, I just have awkward silences. Um,
Okay, I'll volunteer you.
I think for international observers who are, less well versed perhaps with the U.S. Electoral College system and all of its complexities, don't focus too much on the horse race polling numbers. That is what led to such a disconnect in the last elections. And also remember that the margin of error in these polls can be as much as 3 to 5 percentage points. The indicator that I think is very useful to look at is the question that polling agencies asked about whether people think the country is on the right track or the wrong track, because that's less explicitly partisan or about the personal personalization of leadership approval ratings. And as of January, more than 70% of Americans thought the country was on the wrong track. And that's a very alarming number for an incumbent. And of course, that's before the coronavirus and the expectation that we're heading into a recession. So that is the kind of nonpartisan number I'd suggest. If you want to crunch numbers, look at the battleground states. They're the ones that matter most. And I'd also suggest looking at the performance of the S&P. Certainly President Trump will be. And financial markets have really given the president a huge pass, outperforming back at bull market levels, despite the virus and the protests and everything else. We wouldn't expect protests to hit equity markets, but nevertheless, if the S&P starts to lose confidence in the president, which would likely emerge if there was a sustained second wave, then that's something that will alarm the president. That barometer of his performance really matters to him, and a loss of market confidence would increase the pressure upon him, in my view.
Great. Amy, what would you say we should be looking for between now and November?
So I think Tina's right to dissuade people from focusing on the polling, the national polling. I'm really looking, as many people are, at a couple of key states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, for example. I guess I would never underestimate President Trump. I mean, he has shown himself to be amazingly resilient, as we all know. He's survived all sorts of political scandals that would have taken down anybody else. So I wouldn't discount him, no matter what we're seeing play out in response to any kind of polling. But I would also look at, I do think, whether the economy is rebounding, whether it's on an upswing. It's been a really rough 6 months, but it's going to be, I do think it comes down to how confident people are feeling in terms of their own personal interests. What do their own bank accounts look like? What are the employment numbers looking like, particularly in those key states?
Thank you. Stephen, you have the final word.
Yeah, no, I think, and both panelists have touched on some of the important parts. Obviously, you've got kind of fundamental issues rolling through: the coronavirus, what happens after that, the economic impact, how that plays out, and kind of the civil unrest that stirred up recently and has showed real staying power globally over the last couple of weeks. These are kind of fundamental disruptions that could lead to more political or other types of instability around the world, and things that we don't expect to have happen. But as we head out of the summer and into other things, could cause even more problems that we don't see. So I would look kind of distant early warning, look at the horizon. As they've mentioned, you've got to look at the battleground states, which are very close. And incumbents have a very significant advantage. Clinton really mastered this during his campaigns, where they can roll out policies and define the agenda in the run up to an election. How much that's disrupted by what happens is going to be interesting. And the final point I would make is that, in addition to looking at the battleground states, is these are always really binary challenges. And Biden has really hidden out and had very low exposure. I think one of the Democratic candidates said he's kind of in the bunker right now. And these things are always decided by both the incumbent and how the challenger is defined. And that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out once he has to come out on stage and things shift. If you look at Kerry and Bush in 2004, again, it looked like Bush was in very, very bad shape, but they were able to define Kerry, and that flipped the election that was very close, really came down to Ohio. So it's going to be interesting times as usual.
That was fantastic from all three of our panelists at the end. There was a lot there in those comments. What I'm going to take, I think, away from all three of those is something that Stephen just said, and that's looking towards the days after the period after the coronavirus pandemic, which is music to my ears, just thinking about what's going to come after this pandemic, although I fear that the period after the pandemic is going to be not really around the corner, but sometime down the road. That brings us to a conclusion for tonight's panel. I'm sure if we had an audience, people would join me in thanking our three guests for giving us a fantastic array of insights and opinions into the process, the political process, and what it means for U.S. foreign policy and what foreign policy means for domestic politics. So on behalf of the Center for Geopolitics, thanks for joining us tonight. Goodbye.